All right, one of the most prominent or newer people to really study this idea of social development was a guy named Erikson. And his model of lifelong psychosocial development sees adolescence as a struggle to form an identity. So even though, his developmental kind of chart went all the way from birth to old age, one of the most prominent things to come out of his theory was this identity formation, a sense of self out of the social roles that adolescents are asked to play. So, what he kind of said is that adolescents may try out different selves with peers, with parents, with teachers. They act different ways, try out new ways to be you. And depending and using what works and what doesn't work, you kind of put it all together into creating, what your lifelong identity is going to be. So Erikson said the challenge of adolescence was to test and integrate the role in order to prevent role confusion, which is, not really knowing which pieces of all those different selves that you've tried out is really you. And he said that, if we don't have an identity, then we have role confusion. So what is Erikson's stages look like? Well, again, they start with infancy and they go all the way to adulthood, okay? And there's the 7 stages or 8 stages, okay? The first one is trust versus mistrust. We kind of talked about this again when we talked about early social development and attachment. Talking about needs, are needs dependently met? And if they are, you develop this basic sense of trust. Okay. Toddlerhood is autonomy versus shame and doubt. Toddlers are learning to exercise their will and do things for themselves. Can they try? They try to figure out how can they do it by themselves without help. And if they don't, if they're not allowed to do that, they start to develop this very kind of like internal, this doubting their abilities. They stop trying. In preschool, from about 3 to 6, it's initiative versus guilt. Okay, the preschoolers learn to carry out tasks, carry out plans, or they feel guilty about their efforts to be independent. In elementary school, competence versus inferiority. Children learning to learn the pleasure of applying themselves to tasks, or they start to feel inferior. Adolescence is identity versus role confusions. Teenagers work at refining a sense of self by testing roles, integrating them to form a single identity, and confused about who they are. Then, as we move into adulthood, we go into young adulthood, which is kind of 20s to 40s. Intimacy versus isolation. Young adults struggle to form close relationships and gain the capacity for intimate love, or they start to feel socially isolated. Then we also have middle adulthood, which is generativity versus stagnation, where people start to, discover a sense of contributing to the world through family and work, or they start to lack purpose. They feel like they lacked purpose. This is where we start to see a lot of job changes in this middle adulthood. People kind of have these second careers because they start to look at their life and they're like, what have I done? What have I contributed to the world? I've done nothing. So they start to want to do something that fulfills that need. And then in late adulthood, integrity versus despair. Reflecting on his or her life, an older adult may either feel a sense of satisfaction or a sense of failure. Now, Erickson's stages were continuous. Okay, they weren't like Piaget, where he said, you had to pass through the pre-operational before you got to concrete operational. Erikson said as we pass through these things, are flowing, you get one or the other. And just because you have mistrust doesn't mean that you can't get autonomy, or, if you have trust and autonomy, you still might get guilt and inferiority. Okay, so he did talk about how, it's not, they all kind of continue to flow regardless of how the needs are met, but all of these issues can start to influence, your psychosocial development, how you feel about yourself in the world, and can have some lasting effects. Most of his attention has been on this competency, inferiority, identity, role confusion, and then intimacy, isolation. Those 3 stages is where a lot of Erikson's work was focused on, and where people have followed up on his work because of this idea of the role. And we can't forget that we start with competence versus inferiority. So if a child, entering into this adolescent stage feels inferior, how is that going to play a role in their identity formation? And then if they don't have a strong identity, how can they develop this intimacy that they in their young adulthood? So, other Ericksonian stages of the minds of adolescence, while currently on the identity roles confusion stage, like I just talked about, adolescents ideally just, finished working through the tension of competency versus inferiority. They are ready after adolescence to take off on the challenge of intimacy isolation. Kind of jumped ahead of myself here. Now, one of the things that we're seeing in recent years is because, marriage, education, all of these things are being delayed. This idea of full adult independence has been delayed. We're starting to kind of have this new phase that's coming out called emerging adulthood. So, you know, 18 to 25 is this new stage psychologists are starting to look at where, you're not still an adolescent, but you're not quite in that adulthood. So you're in what we call emerging adulthood. So we're going to work on these a lot in class. But the big thing that you guys really need to make sure you know and understand is you have to know these 8 stages. Okay, you need to know the year, okay, the general year ranges, okay, you need to know the issues, and you need to know the basic issues, okay. This is something that does come up. So again, this is one of those charts that you just really kind of have to memorize. And then in class, we're going to be working with this.